Welcome to today's Sunday service for the First Church in Boston, Unitarian Universalist. Today's sermon is entitled Day or Mourning, Day of Thanks, with Edmund Robinson, interim minister.
Good morning. Welcome to the First Church in Boston. I'm Edmund Robinson. I have the privilege of serving this congregation as its interim minister. Today is the 27th of November, Sunday after the holidays we're going to be talking about. And welcome if you haven't ever been here before. You're most welcome. And if you've been here 300 times, you're also welcome. Take you as you are, whatever stage of your life, whatever challenges you may be facing, and you're welcome to come share those here in this church. We call it the oldest church in Boston and also the newest, because this modern sanctuary was built in 1972, designed by Paul Rudolph, one of the leading modernist architects of the 20th century. And our theme this week is a Native American Heritage Week. And so we're going to have a contemporary poem about Metacomet, also known as King Philip, which gave his name to the war between the natives and the settlers back in the late 17th century. And Margaret Moody is going to read this for us.
Good morning. King Philip Mourning, posted on an off-ramp billboard near where Route 2, undulating across north-central Massachusetts, narrows to one lane each way. I imagine a scattering of cinder block suites, mangy tracts of shag carpet, mold creeping around door jambs, like the motels I rounded on for years as a visiting nurse, ignoring those rooms rented out by the hour for tricks, while triaging desperate homeless families stashed for months by the indifferent state. I know King Philip endures as the colonial moniker for Metacom, Wampanoag Sachem, who waged his desperate war against virulent English settlers across 3 colonies 3.5 centuries ago. My bi-weekly commute, Boston to Vermont, passes through the postcard hamlet of Northfield, hastily abandoned by colonists in the conflict, or sometimes Turner's Falls, where scores of nipmuc woke to be cut down one unsuspecting dawn, blood and entrails adorning the Connecticut River shore. This swatch of New England lies tranquil now, in stately autumnal repose, prim small cottage quadrangles, sprawling hillside pumpkin fields, the apples in our orchard fattening on uncompensated Abenaki soil. We never studied Metacom in school. Our narrative cleared like dishes after that first cordial Thanksgiving meal. We simply inhabited this space. History detoured off as a side road off a secondary highway. Metacom himself was ambushed at last, his head pike-mounted outside Plymouth for a generation. Somber signal to colonists that their new world order had settled in, like a neon vacancy sign where the no has stayed switched off as long as anyone can remember.
Our opening hymn is number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. You're asked to sing through masks if you are singing, and you're invited to rise as you are able. This is a reinterpretation of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. May the light of love be shining deep within your spirit. May the torch of mercy clear the path and show the way. May the horn of plenty sound so everyone can hear it. May the light of love be with you every day. Now I invite you to rise as you are able and willing to the First Church Boston affirmation. We say it in unison. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Thank you. Please be seated. The announcements are in your order of service, the last couple of pages. Looking for ways to participate in the service and the upcoming excitement of the holidays. You've got three opportunities here at First Church. One is winter solstice, which will be on the 21st, Wednesday, the 21st of December. We're looking for readers, actors, and there's a bell ringing show and tell on the as part of the Christmas Eve service on the 24th, and they'll be practicing with the bell choir in the next few weeks. And then choir volunteers. Normally we have a paid choir, but on Christmas we open it up to people who would want to sing with the choir any other way. So that's all the details set forth in there. Anyone else have any other announcements? Oh, yes. Janine.
Good morning, everyone. I am hoping that I will see some of you after church to help make some bows for the wreaths that are coming in this week to adorn the church for the Christmas holidays. I am not a crafty soul, so if I can do this, anybody can do this. It's 2 pieces of ribbon and a pipe cleaner. So please, if you have time after your coffee, please come on in to the auditorium and we'll show you how to do these. Thank you so much.
We'll now have the anthem. Thank you, choir. That was beautiful. It's not a responsive reading, it's a unison reading, but it's number 682. A well-known quote from the Navajo, we'll read it together. Beauty is before me, and beauty behind me. Above me and below me hovers the beautiful. I am surrounded by it. I'm immersed in it. In my youth, I am aware of it. And in old age, I shall walk quietly the beautiful trail. Beauty it is begun. Beauty it is ended. Testing. We have no rocks, but we can come up here and express our joys and concerns, whether we have the pebbles or not. Does anyone want to share something from their recent past or milestone? Okay. Where's Noel?
Noel's down there.
Aha, but he chose that moment to make an escape.
Oh, I'll do it.
Okay.
November 26th, we celebrated our 40th anniversary.
Thank you. Any other joys and concerns from anyone? All right. Oh, yes, David? You're going to have to come up here because if I take the microphone past these speakers, we'll get a feedback.
Anna and I, being Unitarians, do not do typical things. For Thanksgiving, we went to Chinatown for the first time in 2 years, thanks to COVID. The ride took another hour to go, so I was sitting in the park on Chinatown, and as I sat there, a person noticed my hat, and she said, "Oh, what year were you?" And I thought he was referring to my union. I said 888. Well, he was referring to my hat, which was an Emerson hat. He was an Emersonian too, so we got to talking. And it just shows to show you that many times things in your life are not very well pre-planned. Serendipity is a great part of one's life. We got to talking, and I think I will keep him as a contact, which might go on to further my career. One never knows what will happen in the future. When a nice occurrence like this happens, be ready for it and accept it, because there are always unknowns there, some pleasant, some unpleasant. The pleasant ones are more preferable. That was my Thanksgiving.
Now Noel is here.
As you may have read in the notes of Gigi for the music today, for the postlude, it's the recessional of our wedding, which was 40 years ago yesterday, and it's a moment to celebrate.
Indeed. Thank you. And for all those joys and concerns which remain in our hearts unspoken. Now we'll have our sermon reading. Nancy Olson.
This is a reading by Reverend Susan Hull titled Run, River, Run, which references and is based on, thank you, the line, "We are what we are given and what is taken away," by the poet Wendell Berry. The reading begins, Norman McLean wades into the swift silver of Big Blackfoot River, casting for memories with the same reverence that he reserves for trout. Planting his feet in the slowly deepening riverbed, Norman begins to hear the long story of his life cascading by. From his birth in Missoula, Montana, where the riverbanks were the breasts on which he fed as a child, through a restive adolescent initiation in the roaring rapids, the still reflections of his first love, to the dark eddies of gambling and debt that pulled his brother under. Now all are gone home before him in that great race to the sea. Eventually, Norman concludes from the timeless sibilant prayer of water on rock, eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. There is a river that runs through us. It is mystery, it is life, some say God. It descends through my granite soul with the force of gravity and love, plunges through empty canyons, chisels out corridors with its wet hands, and slowly, ever so, widens the cracks and crevices of my failures into pools where grace collects. The injury of the river is also its gift. Where I have been cut deeply, so there life most deeply, most surely flows. I don't believe that the gifts of God come in the form of goodness, but in the face of life itself, in danger's shadow as well as dazzling light, in a disquieted heart as often as a still mind, in labor as in love. If we would receive the sacred, we must receive the river's flow, even as it injures, even as it takes away. I thank God for my handicap, said Helen Keller, unable to hear a bubbling stream or see its glistening green or put it into praise. Yet she praises. I thank God for my handicaps, for through them I have found myself, my work, my God. That, to me, is thanksgiving. It's not about being glad for the good things that have happened to us. They are simply moments in the sun. Thanksgiving is standing still with an injured and an open heart and letting the river run freely through us. Each year at this time, I stop and cast into the water. I recount the story of the year past, of life given and taken away, our planet's staggering losses, our moments of forgiveness, our fulgent gains. I think of a friend's child who came swimming into this world on amniotic rivers, and I remember my grandmother's final crossing over to the other shore. I remember the intense hope of eyes brimming with the vows of marriage and the loosening tears of those whose hope was broken. I think of my own love found or friends lost. We are what we are given and what is taken away, blessed by the name of the giver and taker. The confluence of all things returns to the sea, the source. The gift unites with the giver. Let the river run. The banks of my heart are wide with thanks.
Our sermon hymn is number 17, William Blake, Every Night and Every Morn. Please rise as you're able. Every night and every morning. Day of mourning, day of thanks. November is Native American Heritage Month, and that reminds me of a Thanksgiving I spent in law school in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. My first wife and I hosted a turkey dinner for all the students who did not have family locally, and one of the guests in attendance was Danny, a fellow student who was a Navajo from Arizona. Danny was about to tuck into a turkey leg when he noticed Kevin, one of the other guests. Kevin did not have anything on his plate. Danny offered to split the drumstick with our friend Kevin, who replied that he was a vegetarian. After 50 years, I can still remember Danny's response. Well, okay, if you are a friend of Edmund's, I can be friends with you, but I have to tell you it's against my religion. He went on to explain that his faith required him to eat meat. That's right, his faith required him to eat meat, but he had to apologize to the spirit of the animal before he ate its flesh. That was my introduction to Thanksgiving from a Native American perspective. In our service this morning, we will look back to the holiday we celebrated last Thursday, and the title of the sermon is the two names by which the people are calling this holiday, Day of Thanks, Day of Mourning. What I want to ask here is whether these phrases are two separate holidays or one holiday by two names. In pursuit of that question, I will introduce you to Frank James. Wamsutta Frank James was a member of the Wampanoag tribe who lived his life in Chatham on Cape Cod. He was a talented musician and the first Native American graduate of the New England Conservatory. He might have been headed for spots in orchestras, but he ran into prejudice there and spent a long career in music education in the Cape Cod public schools. But Frank also became an Indian rights activist. Fast forward to 1970 in Plymouth. Plymouth, Massachusetts got its fame from the landing there in 1620 of the Mayflower. In 1970, as the 350th anniversary of that milestone approached, the committee planning its celebration asked the Wampanoag tribe to send a speaker to the ceremony, and they chose Frank James, who had adopted the name Wamsutta as an old honorific within that tribal tradition. But when the organizers saw what Wamsutta Frank James was planning to say, they would not let him speak. Frank and his allies went on to rename this holiday from Thanksgiving Day to a national day of mourning. We know what Frank James would have said because he promptly published the talk when the committee would not permit him to speak. Here's a little of what Frank James was going to say on that occasion almost 50 years ago. It is with mixed emotion that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America, a time of looking back, of reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. Even before the Pilgrims landed, it was common practice for explorers to capture Indians, take them to Europe, and sell them as slaves for 220 shillings apiece. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. Mort's relation, that's a history of the time, describes a searching party of 16 men. Mort goes on to say that this party took as much of the Indians' winter provisions as they were able to carry. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, knew these facts. This is still Frank James talking. Knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of the Plymouth plantation. Perhaps he did this because his tribe had been depleted by an epidemic, or his knowledge of the harsh oncoming winter was the reason for his peaceful acceptance of these acts. This action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people, end quote. That's the words of Wamsutta Frank James. Let's remind ourselves of where the story of the first Thanksgiving comes from. It occurred in Plymouth, less than 100 miles from here. We know about it because of a few sentences in a letter written by a pilgrim named Edward Winslow on December 11th, 1621, to a friend back in England. Quote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might, after a more special manner, rejoice together." Fowling means shooting birds. We might rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others, end quote. That's the letter of Edward Winslow, the only historical account we have of that feast. Out of this terse account, white America has spun the myth of the first Thanksgiving, the holiday many of us grew up celebrating. To many, it is dearer than Christmas. Certainly, many of us attempt to get our families together for the occasion, with the result that on the roads, rails, and in the skies, the days around the holiday are the busiest travel days of the year. Think about Wamsutta Frank James, the Wampanoag activist who tried to articulate a Native American view on Thanksgiving. He proposed that while white Americans were reenacting the feast the Wampanoag shared with the Pilgrim settlers, the Native American reaction should be one of mourning. Mourning for that feast, viewed from the perspective of today, represented a last chance for the indigenous residents of New England to put the colonial genie back in the bottle. If Massasoit had slaughtered the settlers instead of feasting with them, the argument goes, they could have intimidated other groups of settlers from attempting to put down roots. I have serious doubts that this historical argument is true for several reasons. First, the Europeans, just by coming here, represented a threat to the natives in the form of diseases for which the natives had no immunity. Secondly, the Europeans had firearms, and the natives at first did not. Thirdly, the political and religious forces which induced some English migration was continuous. If the Plymouth separatists had all been murdered by Massasoit's warriors, there's a fair possibility that other Calvinists would soon arrive to try their luck. What draws families together at this time of year? What is the big attraction? What goal is so valuable that it is worth an 8-hour ordeal in 2 or 3 airports? Maybe it is the chance to see people whom you haven't seen for years or decades. Maybe it is to reassure yourself that you do have a home or that you once had a home. Maybe it's to see if your Uncle Vinny has changed his outrageous political opinions in the light of what we know now. No, I don't think these reasons touched Frank James's concern. If white Americans wanted to celebrate their family histories, to honor their ancestors, to take trips down memory lane, they were only doing what immigrant groups from other countries had always done. The problem is when we take this little feast story and use it to assure ourselves that our ancestors treated Native Americans fairly, that there was peace between the red and the white, which is palpably not true. I can understand how that kind of whitewash should be condemned, because it is not honest history. 50 years ago, Wamsutta Frank James would urge his listeners to rise above the myth of the friendly Indians and the Pilgrims and to keep in mind the tragedy of the Native American dispossession. There certainly is enough injustice and sadness almost anywhere you can pick up the story of the relations between Native Americans and European-descended colonists. But history is not static, my friends. We know more about that history than people did 50 years ago. And we know more about it from the point of view of indigenous people. In September, I preached on a book called The Dawn of Everything by an anthropologist and an archaeologist, a couple of radical scholars re-examining some precepts of the theories on how societies evolve. That book put forth the idea that many of the best ideas of the Enlightenment, which we had been taught was a European invention, actually arose from the encounter of European with native cultures in the Age of Discovery. Now there's another book which has come out in a similar vein, Pekka Hämäläinen's Indigenous Continent. Hämäläinen is a Finnish scholar of the history of indigenous America, and he sets out in his book to deconstruct some of the myths with which people have approached this history. His book was reviewed in the New Yorker a few weeks back by a Native American scholar named David Troyer, who teaches at the University of Southern California. At the outset of his review, Troyer quotes a passage from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. How many people are familiar with that book? A lot of us, I think. One of the classic accounts of the Native American tragedy, and one which resonates well with the Frank James's speech of the same era. This is the quote from the New Yorker review. In the opening pages, Brown wrote, "The greatest concentration of recorded experience and observation came out of the 30-year span between 1860 and 1890, the period covered by this book. It was an incredible era of violence, greed, audacity, sentimentality, undirected exuberance, and an almost reverential attitude toward the ideal of personal freedom for those who already had it. During that time, the culture and civilization of the American Indian was destroyed," end quote. The reviewer David Troyer tells us he read those words when he was a college student, but they did not seem to describe accurately his experience. He read Wounded Knee when he was a college student at Princeton, and he said that other Native Americans were few and far between in that place, but the central thesis of the book still didn't match his observations. Quote, this is the reviewer, Troyer, "Far from my Ojibwe homeland, marooned I sometimes felt on the distant shore of a self-satisfied republic, I readily accepted the version of history promoted by Brown's book, that Native American history was a litany of abuses, disease, slavery, warfare, dispossession, forced removal, the near extermination of the American bison, land grabs, forced assimilation, that had erased our way of life. And yet, my culture and the civilization didn't feel gone. When I look westward and back in time, I couldn't help thinking that Brown's historical record was incomplete, that the announcement of our collective death was rather premature," end quote. So this new book, Indigenous Continent, aims to correct the record. There were many forms of native social life when the Europeans arrived, and it is an oversimplification to say that the settlers called all the shots. There were patterns of domination by one tribe over another. Troyer summarizes Hämäläinen's book this way, quote, "In its opening pages, Hämäläinen maintains that the America we know was in its borders, shape, and culture far from inevitable. Even after the so-called colonial era, tribal nations often played a determining role in American history. In his view, we should speak not of colonial America, but of an indigenous America that was only slowly and unevenly becoming colonial, and recognize that the central reality of the period was ongoing indigenous resistance. By 1776, he notes, European powers had claimed most of the continent, but indigenous people continued to control it. Instead of a foreordained story of decline and victimization, Hämäläinen wants us to see a parade of contingencies, with native nations regularly giving as good as they got, or even better. The result, he promises, will be a North American history recentered on native people and their own overwhelming and persisting power. The question before us now is, does the mourning we may do for the injustices suffered by the original human inhabitants of this land prevent us from coming together to offer thanks for the blessings we have in this life, for our sorrow over the injustices of the past, and our mindfulness of the ways in which our sojourn on this planet has been blessed by beauty, love, support, are quite different things. They're apples compared with oranges. Yes, as a person of European descent, I acknowledge that my ancestors probably participated in some way, direct or indirect, in the dislocation and removal of native tribes from the Southwest in the event we know as the Trail of Tears. As I acknowledge that my southern ancestors enslaved people of African descent, as I acknowledge that the land on which this church is built was at one time occupied by the Massachusetts people, it does not surprise me that the history of relations between these various kinds of people are subject to distortion, self-justification. As most of you know, I recently lost my brother, and while I'm not doing anything formal about that, I feel his loss keenly several times a day. That experience gives me some idea of what mourning is. I'm quite willing to mourn the treatment of indigenous people I've never met but know only through history books. But a wider view encompasses both thanksgiving and grief, or as we just sang in the Blake hymn, joy and woe are woven fine. The reading from my friend and colleague Susan Hull that preceded this sermon makes the point that giving thanks does not mean we are free of pain and suffering. Thanks is our involvement in whatever human drama is being played out in our lives. It may be comfortable, it may be uncomfortable. Susan Hull writes that Thanksgiving, quote, is not about being glad for the good things that have happened to us. They are simply moments in the sun. Thanksgiving is standing still with an injured and an open heart and letting the river run freely through us, end quote. Day of mourning or day of thanks? If we take Thanksgiving as Susan Hull defines it, we can observe both. We can be sorry for all the harm that European America did to indigenous America, while we are thankful for the ways in which indigenous communities are now trying to reclaim their culture. Do you know that years after the last native speaker of the Wampanoag language passed away, a scholar on Cape Cod is resurrecting that language and trying to teach it to native children there? Let us pray. Spirit of life and love, keep us mindful of the blessings bestowed on us in this life, the glory of the sunrise and the smell of the fresh dew on the grass and the song of the lark. Keep us just as mindful of the historic injustices which have resulted in the imbalances we see today. Let us count among our blessings the will and the resolve to right these wrongs to the extent it is in our power to do so. Let neither our grieving nor our giving thanks be restricted to one Thursday in November, but be a part of our lives all year around. Amen. Now let us receive the offering for the advancement of this church.
If you'd like to support the work of this church with a financial donation, you may write out a check to First Church Boston and mail it to 66 Marlborough Street, 02116. You can also donate via text. Simply text the dollar amount to 617-917-5610. You'll receive email confirmation. Thank you.
join me in extinguishing the chalice with the words in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our closing hymn is number 349. May the light around us guide our footsteps and hold us to the best and most righteous that we seek. May the darkness around us nurture our dreams and give us rest so that we may give ourselves to the work of the world. Let us seek to remember the wholeness of our lives, the weaving of light and shadow in this great and astonishing dance in which we move. Amen. Blessed be.
Feel free to join us live each Sunday at 66 Marlborough Street at the corner of Berkeley Street in Back Bay. If you'd like more information about programs, services, or membership at First Church, please visit the website www.firstchurchboston.org or send an email to office@firstchurchboston.org.